That night, an unexpected invitation arrived in the hands of the most silent and invisible cleaner in the entire company. It came signed by the owner of the corporation himself, one of the most powerful and feared men in Ireland. But the invitation wasn't a gesture of kindness. It was a trap, and everyone knew it, except her. Only when she crossed the mansion gates dressed like a queen, head held high, wearing a dress that seemed torn from a forgotten past, everyone stopped, including him. In that instant, the game turned, and what was meant to be a public humiliation transformed into the most devastating night in the lives of everyone present. But no one imagined what this woman was about to reveal, nor what she had sacrificed, in silence, for all these years. Because sometimes the person you despise most is the only one still fighting for your life. If stories like this touch you, subscribe to the channel now. You won't want to miss any of them. The fine rain that covered the rooftops of Dalkey that morning was nothing compared to the storm that Bríd ní Riain carried in her eyes. As she polished the floor of the O'Sullivan and Lairth property headquarters, Saoirse Loughrey's heels clicked behind her with the same sound of contempt that Bríd had known for decades. "You've left marks on the glass door. Pay more attention." Bríd simply nodded. No one there knew who she really was. Not even Saoirse, who by a merciless irony of fate carried the blood that Bríd had been forced to abandon. The company she cleaned was built with the profits of the man who had once destroyed her youth. At 59, Bríd's copper-red hair was pulled back in a low bun, with gray strands visible like silver threads marking each year of suffering. Her pale skin, dotted with freckles that told stories of an Irish childhood, remained hidden beneath the simple cleaning uniform. A starched white shirt, dark heavy cotton trousers, and a gray apron that seemed to absorb all the dignity from her movements. But her eyes, those green eyes that had once sparkled with dreams, now carried the weight of decades of silence. Whilst scrubbing the floor, Bríd glimpsed through the crack in the door the very Cormac O'Sullivan laughing with executives, holding flutes of imported champagne. The same man who, at 31, had got her pregnant and then cast her from his life as if she were dirt from the pavement. His dark brown hair was now slicked back with visible receding hairline, his cold eyes scanning the room with the same authoritarian posture that had intimidated her all those years ago. He wore his tailored dark blue suit like armor, the gray waistcoat and burgundy tie completing the image of a man who believed himself untouchable, the same man who now planned a luxurious event to celebrate the company's new building, inviting businessmen, politicians, and employees, but not all of them, just one, only Bríd. Saoirse handed her the invitation with subtle arrogance, her platinum blonde hair pulled back in a firm ponytail, her angular features sharp with disdain. The structured charcoal gray blazer and high-waisted trousers made her look like a blade in human form. "The boss wants to show he's inclusive. You'll represent the working class, but don't be late, and please, try not to smell of bleach." Bríd gripped the envelope with her wax-stained fingers. She knew this wasn't an invitation. It was a trap, and she would go. On the night of the event, whilst all the city lights reflected in the windows of Cormac's mansion, Bríd walked along the dark pavement with a box under her arm. Inside, the dress she hadn't worn for 34 years, the same one she'd worn on the day she was expelled from her parents' home for being pregnant and alone. She wouldn't go as an employee. She would go as Bríd ní Riain, daughter of noble musicians, a silenced woman, and mother of a daughter who hated her without knowing why. When she crossed the gate, the security guard stopped talking. She entered, transformed. The dark wine velvet dress with its high collar and long sleeves flowed around her like liquid dignity. Her hair, now loose with natural waves, caught the light of the chandeliers. The discreet jewelry inherited from her family gleamed softly against her pale skin. And the moment everyone's eyes turned to that figure dressed in wine and dignity, a cutting silence fell over the hall. Saoirse, upon seeing her, widened her eyes. The cleaning lady had vanished, replaced by a woman who carried herself like royalty. Cormac let his glass slip through his fingers, the champagne spreading across the marble floor like spilled blood. The executives stopped mid-conversation, their mouths agape. And Bríd simply smiled, a smile that held 34 years of pain, love, and secrets. The first glance between Bríd and Cormac, after 34 years, froze the party. But neither of them was prepared for what Saoirse would say seconds later, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. "Sorry, are you my mother?" Saoirse stared at Bríd with a mixture of revulsion and doubt, her penetrating gaze trying to make sense of what her heart had just whispered. The entire hall now murmured like a disturbed beehive, the sound of expensive shoes shuffling on marble mixing with barely contained gasps. Cormac stepped forward, his face pale beneath the perfectly groomed exterior, trying to force a smile that looked more like a grimace. "She's just an employee. The party is open to all staff. Let's ignore this ridiculous interruption and continue enjoying ourselves." But Sorcia's voice cut through the murmur like a blade through silk. "You owe me an explanation now." Her words carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but underneath lay a tremor that betrayed the earthquake happening within her chest. Brid's heart raced like a wild horse, 34 years of dreams and nightmares colliding in a single moment. For decades she had imagined this scene, the reunion, the recognition, the tears of joy, but not like this. Not in front of Dublin's elite, not whilst her daughter looked at her with disgust, not whilst the man who had destroyed her life watched with calculating eyes. "I'm not your mother. This is a misunderstanding." The words escaped before her heart could stop them, each syllable a betrayal of everything she had longed to say. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but how could she tell the truth here, now, like this? Sorcia laughed, a sound devoid of humor, sharp and nervous like breaking glass. Without another word, she disappeared amongst the guests, her steel-gray blazer cutting through the crowd like the fin of a shark. Behind the scenes of the party, Breed sought refuge in the ladies' lavatory, her hands trembling as she locked the door. The mirror reflected a stranger, a woman caught between two worlds, wearing the dress of her past whilst living the nightmare of her present. She leaned against the marble sink and opened her handbag with shaking fingers. Inside, nestled between old tissues and worn prayer cards, lay the envelope with the DNA test she had secretly requested months before, the laboratory results that confirmed what her heart had screamed for 34 years. Sorcia Lawfrey was her daughter, her blood, her flesh. The problem was that Sorcia had grown up hearing a different story, a tale carefully crafted by those who wanted to erase Brid from history. She had been told her mother was a drug-addicted woman, unworthy and vanished, someone who had abandoned her like rubbish left by the roadside. And now this woman, impeccably dressed and carrying herself with unexpected dignity, was claiming the opposite. Brid tore the paper into pieces, watching the fragments fall like snow into the pristine toilet bowl. It wasn't the time. Not yet. The truth needed to be handled delicately, like a newborn bird. But as she left the bathroom, smoothing down her velvet dress and trying to regain her composure, she heard voices behind the partially open door of Cormac's private study. His voice, deeper now with age but still carrying that same arrogant tone that had haunted her dreams. "It's rather amusing, isn't it? She cleans my toilet during the day and now wants to clean my reputation at night. Some people never learn their place in the world." The following morning arrived gray and cold, matching the storm brewing in Sorcia's heart. She entered Breed's small office at the company headquarters like a general preparing for battle. Her platinum hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features into a mask of fury. Without ceremony, she threw a manila folder onto the scratched wooden desk, with enough force to scatter the few personal items Brid kept there. "Voluntary resignation letter. Sign it or I'll prosecute you for invasion of privacy and harassment. I know you've been stalking me, following me, trying to insert yourself into my life with this ridiculous charade." Sorcia's voice was ice cold, each word precisely delivered like bullets from a rifle. Brid stared into her daughter's eyes, those familiar green eyes that mirrored her own, and for the first time in decades, her voice didn't waver, didn't break, didn't whisper. "You can take my job away from me, but you won't take the truth away from me. Some things can't be erased no matter how much money changes hands or how many lies are told." She stood up slowly, dignity flowing through her movements like water through stone. Taking her worn woolen coat from the back of her chair, she walked towards the door, leaving Sorcia standing there, astonished by the quiet strength in this woman she had dismissed as nothing more than a cleaner. In the corridor, Cormac was waiting for her, leaning against the wall with a false smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "If you open your mouth about the past, about things that are better left buried, I'll destroy you completely. You have nothing. You are nothing, and you'll remain nothing." And Brid replied, her voice steady as stone, "The only thing that's going to be destroyed is your empire built on lies. I know what you did all those years ago, and I know exactly who you paid to make me disappear." In her small terraced house in Dalkey that evening, Brid opened an old wooden box that had sat untouched in her wardrobe for years. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper, lay a letter that had never been sent. addressed to the family who had adopted her daughter, a letter that had mysteriously disappeared from the orphanage's outgoing mail in the same month that Cormac O'Sullivan had made a substantial donation to St. Macartan's convent. Years before, in a stifling autumn of 1989, Breed had been left bleeding at the door of St. Macartan's convent after a violent argument with her own mother, who had expelled her from home upon learning of the pregnancy. The shame had been too much for the family to bear. An unmarried daughter carrying the child of a man who refused to acknowledge either of them. The nun who took her in, Sister Mary Catherine, had been kind enough, noting down Breed's details with careful handwriting in the convent's leather-bound registry. But the next day, when Breed asked to see the record, it had already vanished as if it had never existed. The young woman who had arrived broken and bleeding had been erased from history with the efficiency of a professional cleaner removing a stain. When she tried to visit her daughter days after the birth, a traumatic labor that left her weak and desperate, the orphanage informed her with cold politeness that the baby had already been transferred to another family in Dublin. And Breed's file, it simply didn't exist anymore. The child's name changed from the Irish name Breed had chosen to something more suitable for a prosperous Protestant family. Everything had disappeared like morning mist, leaving her with nothing but the physical pain of childbirth and the emotional agony of stolen motherhood. She spent the following years with the emptiness of a mother who hadn't lost a daughter through death or accident, but had motherhood itself torn away without the right to grieve, to remember, or to hope. There were no visiting rights, no updates, no photographs. Just a void where her heart should have been. She learned to live with that absence, taking jobs that kept her invisible, staying in the shadows of a world that had decided she didn't deserve to exist as a mother. Back in the present, with her hands still trembling from the encounter with Sorcha, Breed knew she had to confront the only person who might know the truth about those missing records. Father Lorcan O'Keefe, now in his 70s and officially retired, had been connected to the diocese and the convent during those crucial years. She found him in his small cottage in Blackrock, tending to a garden that seemed too large for his bent frame. The conversation began stiffly, like a confession without absolution. He offered her tea from a chipped cup, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he poured. "I remember you," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "You were the girl with the music in her voice even when you were crying." When Breed pressed him about the missing records, about the mysterious disappearance of her paperwork, he hesitated for long minutes, staring out at his roses as if they might provide answers. "There was a man," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Came to see me 3 days after your child was born. Well-dressed, confident, carrying an envelope thick with money. Said he wanted to clean a stain from his family name, make sure certain complications were handled with discretion." Father Lorcan's eyes finally met hers, and she saw the guilt he had carried for decades. He called it social providence, said the child would have better opportunities and you, well, you would be free to start again somewhere else. Breed left the cottage in silence, her mind reeling with the confirmation of what she had always suspected. Deep down in the darkest corner of her heart, she had always known that Cormac's hand had guided her daughter's disappearance, but having it confirmed felt like being shot all over again. Now she had a concrete piece of evidence, but she still lacked the courage to tell Sorcha the truth. After all, how do you tell a woman who despises you, who sees you as nothing more than hired help, that you bled for her, that you gave up everything so she could live? That same evening, as Dublin's lights began to twinkle like fallen stars, Eaba Flannery arrived at Breed's house with news that would change everything. Eaba, her only true friend and a woman whose own life had been marked by loss, sat heavily in the worn armchair and delivered words that fell like stones into still water. "I've just come from the hospital, Breed. It's Sorcha. She's got kidney disease. Advanced stage. The doctors say she needs a transplant urgently," or she couldn't finish the sentence. The world collapsed around Breed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Her hands began to shake so violently she had to clasp them together. "Is she going to die?" The words came out like a prayer, desperate and broken. Eaba's silence was answer enough before she finally nodded. "If they don't find a compatible donor in 3 months, possibly less. The doctors aren't optimistic. Her body is rejecting the dialysis and she's not responding well to treatment." Breed looked down at her own hands, the same hands that had scrubbed floors for decades, that had been dismissed and ignored, that had never been allowed to hold her daughter. Sorcha didn't know who she was, hated her with every fiber of her being, wanted her gone from her life completely, but she was dying. And Brittany Riane, the invisible woman, the erased mother, was possibly the only person who could save her. That night, Brid contacted St. Vincent's Hospital with trembling fingers dialing the number. "I want to be tested as a kidney donor," she said to the night receptionist. "But I have one condition. I don't want the recipient to know who I am." The doctor she eventually spoke to, Dr. Sarah Walsh, asked with professional concern, "Are you absolutely certain about this?" "Anonymous donation is possible, but it's a serious decision," and Brid replied, her voice steady for perhaps the first time in years. "If she knows who I am, she'll refuse the organ. And I can't let my daughter die even if she never knows I'm her mother." The surgery was scheduled in absolute secrecy, arranged through the hospital's anonymous donor program with the efficiency of a military operation. To everyone involved, nurses, surgeons, administrators, it was simply another case of an anonymous Good Samaritan saving a stranger's life. The paperwork listed Brid only as donor 247, whilst Sorcha remained unaware that her salvation would come from the woman she had spent years despising. Sorcha, weakened by months of failed treatment and growing desperation, had finally accepted the reality of her situation. Her platinum hair had begun to thin, her angular features had grown gaunt, and the commanding presence that had once intimidated employees now seemed fragile as spun glass. She signed the consent forms with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the kidney failure that was slowly poisoning her body. In the preoperative ward, Brid observed her daughter from afar through the small window in the corridor, drinking in every detail like a woman dying of thirst. Sorcha lay connected to monitors and IV drips, her pale skin almost translucent against the white hospital sheets. Even diminished by illness, she maintained that proud bearing that had made her such a formidable director. "If only my mother had loved me enough to stay," she whispered to Nurse Margaret, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of 34 years of abandonment. "Maybe I wouldn't be so afraid of dying alone." Brid pressed her forehead against the cool glass, tears streaming down her cheeks as she swallowed her sobs. She wanted to rush in, to hold Sorcha's hand, to whisper that she had never stopped loving her, that every day without her had been a small death. Instead, she swallowed time itself, swallowed decades of silence, swallowed the words that might have healed them both. The scalpel would cut more than skin and tissue. It would sever the invisible threads of a hidden story that now bled with love to save the life that mattered most. During the procedure, which lasted nearly 6 hours, the kidney was successfully transplanted into Sorcha's failing body. Dr. Walsh emerged from the operating theater with cautious optimism. The organ had been accepted immediately, and Sorcha's body was already showing signs of recovery. But in the adjacent theater, Brid was fighting for her own life. Post-surgical complications had set in with devastating speed. Internal bleeding that wouldn't stop, blood pressure dropping to dangerous levels, her body struggling to cope with the trauma of major surgery at her age. The medical team worked frantically, but Brid had already signed the advance directive forms that reflected her deepest conviction. "I do not want to be resuscitated if there is multiple organ failure. Let me go peacefully." For her, life was already complete. She had saved her daughter, had given Sorcha the chance to live fully, to love, to find happiness. Even if Sorcha would never know the source of her salvation, even if the gift would remain forever anonymous, it was enough. It was everything. Before the sedatives pulled her under for the final time, Brid managed to grip Ayaba's hand with the last of her strength. Her friend leaned close to hear the whispered words. "In my bedside drawer, there's a sealed letter. Give it to her, but not now. Wait a year. Let her live without guilt first, without the weight of knowing. Let her be healthy and strong before she learns the truth." Her voice faded to barely a breath. "Give her time to forgive me for leaving, before she knows I never really left at all." Meanwhile, in his penthouse office overlooking Dublin Bay, Cormac O'Sullivan received the news with the emotional detachment of a man reading stock reports. His secretary, Mrs. Eleanor Byrne, knocked discreetly and entered with obvious reluctance. "Sir, I have some news about one of the former employees. Brittany Riane died during a medical procedure last night." Cormac barely looked up from his financial papers, his voice flat and dismissive. "Finally, I assume that's the end of whatever nonsense she was planning." But before Mrs. Byrne could leave the room, before Cormac could return to his world of profits and power, she delivered the words that would shatter his carefully constructed reality. "And sir, the hospital informed us that she died after donating her kidney to Director Sorcha Lawfrey. They said she insisted on remaining anonymous even in death." Cormac's face went ashen, his hands beginning to shake as the full implications crashed over him like a tsunami. He stood up so quickly his chair fell backwards, his eyes wide with something approaching terror. "What did you say?" But Mrs. Byrne had already left, closing the door softly behind her. Alone in his opulent office, surrounded by the trophies of his success, Cormac stared out at the gray Irish sky and realized that the past he thought he had buried was very much alive and had just saved the life of the daughter he had stolen from the woman he had destroyed. At Glasnevin Cemetery 3 days later, a small group gathered around a simple grave marked only with Breed's name and dates. Sorcia, still recovering but insisting on attending, observed the burial from a distance, leaning heavily on her walking stick. She still didn't know who this woman had been, why her death felt like a stone in her chest, why her dreams were now filled with gentle hands and a voice that seemed familiar. But for the first time since her surgery, she felt something strange and profound. A tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with physical pain, and an inexplicable urge to cry for a woman whose name she was only now learning to pronounce. In her coat pocket, her fingers found an envelope she didn't remember putting there, sealed with red wax and bearing her name in careful handwriting, a name that somehow felt like coming home. Sorcia returned to her routine days after the surgery, her body responding to the new kidney with remarkable efficiency. The doctors marveled at how quickly she was recovering, how seamlessly her system had accepted the donated organ. But whilst her physical health improved dramatically, her mind plunged into a type of emptiness that was difficult to describe and impossible to escape. Sleep became elusive, haunted by recurring nightmares featuring a faceless woman with bloodied hands reaching out to her, always just beyond recognition. The medical team assured her this was normal. Post-surgical trauma, they called it, a common psychological response to major organ transplantation. Many recipients experienced vivid dreams, sometimes even feeling a connection to their anonymous donors. "It's your mind processing the magnitude of what's happened," Dr. Walsh explained during one of their follow-up appointments. "Someone you'll never meet gave you the gift of life. That's a profound psychological burden to process." But there was something more troubling Sorcia, something that went beyond standard medical explanations. The implacable director who had once stridden through the office corridors like a conquering general now found herself walking more slowly, pausing to observe the employees with a gentleness that surprised everyone, including herself. She noticed things she had never seen before: the exhaustion in the cleaning staff's eyes, the careful way they moved around her as if expecting criticism, the quiet dignity they maintained despite being treated as invisible. The arrogance remained, ingrained by years of wielding power, but the poison seemed diluted somehow. Where once she might have snapped at a secretary for a minor error, she now found herself simply pointing out the mistake and moving on. Colleagues whispered about the change, wondering if her illness had fundamentally altered her personality. Some cynically suggested it was a performance designed to improve her public image after the scandal of the mysterious party incident. On her mahogany desk, Sorcia constantly found small disruptions that defied explanation. Papers that had been perfectly aligned would be slightly askew when she returned from meetings. Her fountain pen would be moved a few centimeters from where she'd left it. A teacup would appear that she didn't remember requesting. At first, she blamed the cleaning staff or attributed it to her own medication-induced confusion. But the disturbances felt too deliberate, too careful to be accidents. One particularly gray Dublin morning, as October rain lashed against her office windows, Sorcia decided to thoroughly search her desk for the source of these mysterious rearrangements. Upon opening the last drawer of her executive desk, a drawer she rarely used, reserving it for documents she wanted to forget, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. There, nestled beneath old tax returns and forgotten contracts, lay a brown envelope sealed with red wax, with her name written in elegant handwriting she didn't recognize. No return address, no company letterhead, no indication of where it had come from, or how long it had been there. Part of her knew instinctively that this envelope contained something that would fundamentally change her understanding of her own life. Part of her was terrified of not being able to bear whatever truth lay within those sealed pages. She left it untouched for weeks, sometimes opening the drawer just to stare at it, as if prolonged observation might reveal its secrets without the need to break the wax seal. The doubt became unbearable as November approached, eating at her like acid. Finally, on the last Sunday of autumn, with the Irish countryside painted in shades of gold and crimson, she found the courage to break the seal. Her hands trembled as she unfolded pages covered in trembling handwriting, the careful script of someone whose hands were no longer steady, but whose heart remained absolutely certain. "My dearest Sorcia," the letter began, and immediately she knew her world was about to collapse. "You were born from my body on a cold March morning 34 years ago. I was prevented from seeing you, from touching you, from singing the lullabies I had composed during the long months when you grew beneath my heart. I worked for years by your side, close enough to hear your voice, to see you grow into the strong woman I always prayed you would become. Even though you hated me, despised the very sight of me, you were alive and thriving, and that was enough. It had to be enough." The words continued, each sentence a revelation that shattered everything Sorcia thought she knew about her origins. "If you are reading this, it is because my life no longer exists, but yours continues. The doctors will have told you that an anonymous donor gave you a kidney. They will never tell you it was your mother who died so you could live. Live your life for both of us now, my darling girl. Live it with the love I could never give you openly, but carried in my heart every single day." Sorcia fell to her knees on the expensive Persian carpet, the letter fluttering from her nerveless fingers. For the first time in her life, she cried like an orphaned daughter, not the controlled tears of a professional woman managing a crisis, but the raw, primal sobs of a child who had just discovered that the love she had spent her lifetime searching for had been standing right beside her all along. The woman she had humiliated, dismissed, and treated with casual cruelty had been her mother. The same hands she had watched scrubbing floors had once held her as a newborn baby. The same eyes she had met with coldness had watched her with desperate love for years, in complete and devastating silence. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and leaving her gasping for air. Every harsh word she had spoken to Brid, every look of contempt, every moment of casual arrogance now felt like daggers piercing her own heart. The weight of realization was crushing. She had spent years unknowingly torturing the one person who loved her most in the world, and now it was too late for apologies. Too late for understanding. Too late for the mother-daughter relationship that had been stolen from them both by lies and pride, and the calculated cruelty of powerful men who treated human lives like chess pieces to be moved and sacrificed at will. As the Irish rain continued to fall against her windows like tears from heaven itself, Sorcia understood with perfect clarity that she was now living with her mother's heart beating inside her chest, carrying forward a love that had been too profound to destroy, even by death. The last page of the letter bore a faded photograph, Brid as a young woman, holding a baby wrapped in a white linen shawl. On the back, in that same careful handwriting, "You had your father's green eyes, but your heart was always mine." The following Monday morning arrived cold and unforgiving, matching the ice that had formed around Sorcia's heart during her sleepless night of revelation. She walked into the O'Sullivan and Lairth building, not as an employee returning to work, but as a daughter seeking justice for her murdered mother. The security guards nodded respectfully as she passed, unaware they were greeting a woman transformed by grief into something far more dangerous than they could imagine. Without bothering to knock, Sorcia pushed open the heavy oak doors to Cormac's private office and found him reviewing financial reports over his morning coffee. The man who had destroyed her family sat there in his perfectly tailored navy suit, his silver hair immaculately styled, looking every inch the successful businessman who had built an empire on the ruins of other people's lives. She placed Brid's letter on his mahogany desk with deliberate care, as if she were laying down a weapon. Cormac read in silence, his face betraying nothing except a slight tightening around his cold eyes. When he finished, he actually had the audacity to laugh, a sound like breaking glass that made Sorcia's blood boil. "She manipulated you even from beyond the grave. How perfectly pathetic. Did you really think a dead cleaning woman's sob story would mean anything to me?" But his eyes told a different story. Behind the practiced arrogance, Sorcia could see something she had never witnessed before in Cormac O'Sullivan: fear. Raw, primal terror that his carefully constructed world was about to crumble. "You knew," she said, her voice steady as granite. "You knew exactly who she was from the moment she started working here. You brought her here deliberately, didn't you? To torment her. To make her clean the floors of the empire built with money that should have supported her and her child." Cormac leaned back in his leather chair, attempting to project the same commanding presence that had intimidated business rivals for decades. "You wanted to grow up strong, didn't you? And look how magnificently that worked out. You became powerful, successful, feared. Brid would have turned you into nothing more than a sentimental beggar like herself." The tension in the room exploded like a bomb detonating. Sorcha rose from her chair slowly, every movement controlled and deliberate, her eyes never leaving his face. You knew she donated her kidney to save my life. It wasn't a question. The slight twitch of his left eye confirmed what she already suspected. You knew she died loving me in silence whilst you sat here in your palace believing you had won. Cormac's composure finally cracked just for a moment. What does it matter now? She's dead. You're alive. The past is buried where it belongs. But even as he spoke the words, he seemed to realize how hollow they sounded, how utterly inadequate they were in the face of what he had done. Sorcha leaned across the desk, close enough to see her own reflection in his frightened eyes. She died loving me unconditionally whilst you murdered her slowly, day by day, year by year, with every lie you told, every record you destroyed, every moment you stole from us. Her voice dropped to a whisper that was far more terrifying than any shout. But the beautiful thing about truth, Cormac, is that it never really dies. It just waits. She straightened up, smoothed down her charcoal blazer, and walked towards the door with the dignity her mother had taught her through example. I'm resigning from this company immediately. My solicitor will be in touch about the damages owed to the Ni family. And Cormac? She paused at the threshold, not bothering to turn around. I want you to know that every breath I take with my mother's kidney is a reminder that love conquered your hatred. She won. You lost. And you'll spend every remaining day of your miserable life knowing it. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid falling into place. Sorcha walked through the corridors of O'Sullivan and Lerth for the last time, ignoring the stares and whispers of employees who sensed that something momentous had just occurred. She handed her resignation letter to the Human Resources Director, without explanation, and disappeared from the corporate world that had shaped her, leaving behind nothing but questions and the lingering scent of her perfume. Months passed like seasons changing, and gradually the story of Sorcha Loffrey's mysterious departure became Dublin business legend. Some said she had suffered a nervous breakdown following her surgery. Others whispered about a family scandal involving hidden inheritance. The truth, as truth often does, remained buried beneath layers of speculation and gossip. Meanwhile, Cormac O'Sullivan found his empire slowly crumbling around him. Not through any legal action. Sorcha had chosen to pursue justice through different means, but through the corrosive power of reputation and whispered doubts. Business partners began asking uncomfortable questions about his past. Investors started pulling their money from ventures associated with his name. The powerful network of connections that had sustained his success for decades began to distance themselves from a man who suddenly seemed cursed by misfortune. He moved through his mansion like a ghost haunting his own life, surrounded by expensive furniture and priceless art that could no longer provide comfort. The parties stopped. The galas were canceled. The constant stream of visitors seeking his favor dried up completely. In the echoing silence of his Dalkey mansion, the sounds of the past seemed to whisper through every room. Brid's voice, young and hopeful, telling him about the child she carried. The echo of his own cruel laughter as he signed the papers that would erase her from history. One gray December morning, Cormac found an envelope slipped under his front door. No postmark, no return address, just his name written in careful block letters. Inside, he discovered a single pressed flower, a small white daisy, the kind that grew wild in Irish meadows. On the reverse side, someone had written in the same careful handwriting, "Now you know what it feels like to be dead while still breathing. This is how my mother lived for 34 years." For the first time in his 64 years of life, Cormac O'Sullivan sat down on his marble floor and cried, not tears of guilt or remorse. Those emotions remained as foreign to him as compassion or love. These were tears of pure, unadulterated fear. Fear that the world would remember him not as a successful businessman, but as the monster who had destroyed the woman who loved him and stolen a daughter from her mother's arms. Fear that his own legacy would be written in the blood of the innocent people he had crushed beneath his ambition. And most terrifying of all, the growing certainty that justice, like love, sometimes waits 34 years to claim what it is owed. Sorcha never returned to the corporate world that had defined her for so many years. Instead, she disappeared from Dublin's business circles entirely, selling her expensive apartment and moving to a modest cottage on the rugged coast of Connemara, where the Atlantic waves crashed against ancient cliffs with the same relentless rhythm as her mother's heart had once beaten. Here, surrounded by the wild beauty of Western Ireland, she began a different kind of life, one dedicated to healing rather than conquering. Her days were now spent writing letters to women she had never met, widows struggling to raise children alone, Mothers who had lost contact with their daughters. Elderly women forgotten by families who saw them as burdens rather than treasures. She told her story without revealing her identity, sharing the hard-earned wisdom that had come at such a devastating cost. These letters found their way into local newspapers as anonymous columns, left on park benches for strangers to discover, slipped under the doors of women's shelters and community centers across Ireland. "Don't ignore the person who loves you in silence," she wrote in one particularly powerful piece. "The most profound love is often the most invisible, expressed not in grand gestures or passionate declarations, but in the quiet faithfulness of someone who stays near you even when they have every reason to leave. Look for the love that asks for nothing in return, because that is the love that will sacrifice everything for your happiness." 1 year after Breed's death, on a crisp March morning that marked what would have been her mother's 60th birthday, Sorcha organized an event that would have seemed impossible during her corporate days. She rented a small function room in a Galway hotel and invited 10 women who worked as cleaners in various businesses across the county. She cooked the meal herself: traditional Irish stew, brown bread still warm from the oven, an apple tart made from her grandmother's recipe that she had discovered written in her mother's careful handwriting. These women arrived uncertain and slightly suspicious, wondering why a stranger would invite them to such an occasion. They came dressed in their best clothes, simple but dignified outfits that spoke of lives lived with careful economy and quiet pride. As they settled around the table, Sorcha served them herself, refusing their offers to help, insisting that tonight they were to be treated as the queens they had always been. During the meal, she read Breed's letter aloud, her voice breaking at several points but never faltering completely. She told them about the mother she had never known she had, about the love that had been hidden in plain sight for so many years, about the ultimate sacrifice that had saved her life. As she spoke, tears fell freely, not just from her own eyes, but from every woman at the table who recognized something of their own struggles in Breed's story. When she finished speaking, the room was silent except for the soft sounds of weeping. Then one of the women, a grandmother named Siobhan who cleaned offices in Galway City, stood up and began to applaud. The others joined her, and soon the small room was filled with the sound of celebration, not for tragedy, but for the kind of love that transcends death itself. At the end of the evening, Sorcha presented each woman with an envelope containing 10,000 euros, part of the settlement money she had received from O'Sullivan and Lairth's insurance company. "My mother saved my life," she told them as they stared at the checks in amazement. "Now it's my turn to honor her memory by helping other mothers who work invisibly to keep the world running. Use this however you need, for your children's education, for a holiday you've never been able to afford, for the security of knowing you have something put away for emergencies." The women wept again, but these were tears of joy mixed with disbelief. Several of them hugged Sorcha as if she were their own daughter, whispering blessings and promises to remember Brid in their prayers. As they prepared to leave, one of them, a woman with silver hair and hands marked by decades of hard work, pulled Sorcha aside. "You know," she said softly, "you remind me of a daughter I lost many years ago. Same proud way of holding your head, same fierce love in your eyes." Sorcha felt her heart clench with familiar pain and unfamiliar hope. "And you," she replied, "remind me of the mother I always wished I had known." They embraced then, two women who had been shaped by loss but not defeated by it, finding in each other a brief glimpse of what might have been. As Sorcha drove home through the darkness of the Irish countryside, her headlights cutting through mist that rose from ancient bogs, she felt something she had never experienced before, a sense of peace that came not from achieving success or wielding power, but from using her resources to ease other people's suffering. For the first time since receiving her mother's letter, she could imagine a future that held joy as well as sorrow. But when she arrived at her cottage and walked up the stone path to her front door, she discovered that her journey of discovery was far from over. There, tucked carefully under her doormat, was another envelope. This one was newer, sealed with clear tape rather than wax, and bore her name in handwriting that was similar to her mother's but distinctly different. Younger, more confident, written by hands that had never known the trembling uncertainty of age and grief. Inside, she found a recent photograph that made her gasp aloud. Brid, as she had never seen her, younger and radiantly happy, standing hand in hand with a man whose gentle smile and familiar green eyes made Sorcha's heart race with recognition. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in that same confident handwriting, "Conall ní Riain, your brother, we need to talk." Conall ní Riain lived quietly in Galway, working as a traditional music teacher in a small school overlooking the bay, where Spanish galleons had once sought shelter from Atlantic storms. He was the son Brid had conceived 7 years after losing Sorcia, born from a brief but genuine love affair with a fisherman named Paddy Connolly, who had seen past her brokenness to the extraordinary woman beneath. Unlike Sorcia, Connell had never been registered in any official documents, never appeared in birth records or adoption files. He existed in the spaces between bureaucracy, raised by a mother who had learned to be invisible. Brid had told him everything from the time he was old enough to understand. Stories about the sister he had never met, about the powerful woman who unknowingly shared his blood, about the decades of silent observation from the shadows of corporate corridors. "She's not ready to know about us," Brid would say during their long evening conversations by the fire. "Someday, perhaps, when the anger has cooled and the pain has softened. But not yet. She's still too raw, too fierce. She would see our love as weakness rather than strength." Connell had respected his mother's wishes, watching from afar as newspaper photographs showed Sorcia's rise through Dublin's business world. He had felt pride mixed with sorrow as he observed her success, knowing that she had achieved everything Brid had dreamed for her, but at the cost of becoming exactly the kind of person who would despise everything they represented. When news of Brid's death reached him, he had grieved alone, as was their family's way. But now, finally, he sensed that the time for revelation had come. Sorcia's transformation following the kidney transplant, her mysterious departure from the corporate world, her new life dedicated to helping others. These changes suggested a woman who might finally be ready to embrace the family she had never known she had. Their meeting was arranged simply, through a brief phone call that left Sorcia's hands shaking with anticipation and terror. They met on a stone bench overlooking Galway Bay, where fishing boats bobbed like corks on the gray-green water and seagulls wheeled overhead with their ancient cries. Connell was 37 years old, with the same green eyes that marked all the Nerean children and the weathered hands of someone who worked with wood and strings and music, rather than spreadsheets and corporate power. "You look exactly like her," he said when they first saw each other, his voice carrying the soft Galway accent that their mother had never quite lost despite her years in Dublin. "She used to say you were fire made flesh, that you burned everything you touched, but that yours was the most beautiful fire she had ever seen. She was so proud of your strength, even when that strength was turned against her." Sorcia listened in silence as he spoke about their mother's hidden life, about the small cottage where Brid had kept a scrapbook filled with newspaper clippings about her daughter's business achievements, about the way she would light a candle every year on Sorcia's birthday and whisper prayers for her happiness. When their conversation ended, Connell placed a leather-bound journal in Sorcia's hands, a volume she recognized immediately as the one she had sometimes seen her mother writing in during quiet moments at the office. "She wrote in this every day for 27 years, he explained. "Every page is a letter she never sent, words she never spoke, love she never expressed. It's yours now. The weight of it might be more than any inheritance of money or property, but it's what she wanted you to have." Sorcia spent the following weeks reading every single page, laughing and weeping in equal measure as she discovered the depth of love that had surrounded her throughout her life without her knowledge. There were entries about her first day at school, observed from across the street, descriptions of her graduation ceremony, watched from the back of a crowded auditorium, detailed accounts of her business successes, celebrated quietly in a small cottage by a woman who had never been allowed to express her maternal pride publicly. The journal revealed a love so profound and selfless that it challenged everything Sorcia thought she knew about human nature. Here was a woman who had been systematically destroyed by the world, yet who had used her remaining strength not for revenge or bitterness, but to create space for her daughter's happiness. Each entry was a small act of devotion, a proof that love could survive even the most devastating circumstances if it was tended carefully and protected fiercely. On the last day of autumn, as Ireland prepared for the long winter ahead, Sorcia made a pilgrimage to Glasnevin Cemetery carrying her mother's journal and a small bouquet of white daisies, the same flowers that had somehow found their way to Cormac's doorstep. She knelt beside Brid's simple headstone and read aloud from the final entry, dated the day before the kidney donation surgery. "My darling Sorcia," she read through tears that fell like rain on the weathered pages. "Tomorrow I will give you the last gift I have to offer, not just my kidney but my life itself. I am not afraid to die, because I have finally found a way to love you that you cannot reject, cannot turn away from, cannot destroy with anger or pride. You will carry my heart inside your body, and perhaps someday you will understand that everything I did, every sacrifice I made, every moment of silence I endured, was an expression of love too deep for words. The wind that day carried the scent of the sea and the promise of rain, but also something else, a sense of presence that made Sorcia feel less alone than she had in months. She placed the journal carefully beside the headstone, not as an offering to the dead, but as a promise to the living. "I see you now, Mum," she whispered to the gathering darkness. "I see you, and I understand, and I promise that your love will not be wasted. I will live for both of us now with all the fierce grace you showed me how to carry." As she walked away from the cemetery, Sorcia felt the weight of her mother's sacrifice settling into her bones, not as a burden, but as a foundation upon which to build something beautiful. She understood now that love was not always loud or demonstrative, that the most powerful emotions were sometimes expressed through silence, through service, through the willingness to remain invisible while ensuring that those you love can shine in the light you have created for them. The story of Brídni Riain and her daughter became, in its way, a meditation on the nature of love itself, proof that the human heart is capable of surviving any betrayal, forgiving any cruelty, and finding ways to nurture life even in the most desolate circumstances. It was a reminder that the most important battles are often fought in silence, that the greatest victories are sometimes invisible to everyone except those wise enough to look for love in unexpected places. In the end, Brid had won everything that mattered. Her daughter was alive, healthy, and finally beginning to understand the depth of love that had surrounded her always. The truth had emerged from decades of burial, and somewhere in the Irish countryside, her son continued to teach children the old songs, ensuring that the music of their family would echo forward into generations yet unborn. The end. What if you had been silenced for an entire lifetime and still chose love? What if the only chance to be seen was dying in anonymity, but saving someone who forgot you? Would you have forgiven? Would you have loved in silence? Would you have given a part of yourself for someone who only saw you too late? Brídni Riain wasn't seeking revenge. She simply wanted to exist, even if only in the background of the life of the one she loved. And perhaps that's what hurts most, realizing that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't told aloud but lived in silence, drop by drop, until the end. Because deep down, the most heroic acts aren't performed under applause, but under hidden tears. If this story touched your heart, like it, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and follow our channel. The most unforgettable stories are yet to come.